League of Oregon Cities, and we represent all 241 or 242 cities in Oregon, depending on the day. So we are an advocate for all the cities, and we are actually a sub-department of every city in the state. We're here for our 94th annual conference. It's an amazing week. We have record attendance at this one. We have about 1,000 people coming to this, so it's going to be a really great week. We're sharing a lot of information. There are a lot of different sessions that cover everything that has to do with cities. So if you are a city leader, if you're a city administrator, this is the place to be this week. If there's one thing that the League of Oregon Cities can do for cities, it's educate the leaders. It's educate the leadership on the city council. It's educate the paid staff and administrators about how to run a city and what it really takes to get things done in a city. That's the value, or that's one of the big value pieces that the League brings to this, is informing, it's getting together. The networking opportunities here are huge as well. So cities are able to talk to each other about problems that they have in common and maybe solutions that they have. So this is a great information exchange as well as an educational opportunity.
I think it's incredibly important that we partner with state government. We have many of the same mutual interests in mind when it comes to the health of our cities and the well-being of our residents. We really need to have that kind of partnership so that we can be focused in what we do legislatively, and we can be focused in the services that we deliver to our constituents.
I'd like to welcome you to the League of Cities 94th Annual Convention, which is pretty cool. 94 years is a long time to be doing this. The League is not only the organization that puts on this very conference you're sitting at right now, but the League is also involved all over the state on any number of things, well, not any number, more than zero certainly, a bigger number of things that affect every city and every citizen of every city that we have in Oregon.
There's just a myriad of issues that cities face across the state. First and foremost, at least on my list, is helping cities do more with less. So Oregon is unique. We have a constricted amount of money that cities can gather through taxes and through property taxes, and yet this cost for service doesn't go down. We still need to worry about things like infrastructure, like public safety, and cities are trying to figure out how to run their communities on a fixed budget, basically. So we are there to step in to hopefully help and fill the gaps that cities have right now, to figure out what the League can do as a sub-department of every city to step in and to bolster their efforts to make life a little bit easier on them. And we come up with programs that touch that. So it's not just educational programs, but it's actual programs like our pilot legal program, where we're able to go out in Eastern Oregon and place an attorney and answer real legal questions that aren't educational in nature, but are actually answering legal questions that they can then not have to pay a city attorney for. So we're doing some different things that are really beneficial to cities, and that's our job, that's our mission. I don't know if there's a quick silver bullet for mental health. It cascades into so many other areas in cities that cities are dealing with. First and foremost is the homelessness issue. So the housing and the homelessness are one and almost the same. They have to be addressed together. That in turn comes from the mental health issues, which we also need to put more focus in. It's not just throwing these folks in jail, but it's getting them the help they need to get them off the streets. So everything plays into this, and we need to, as a state, as cities, be focused on how do we address that. And what's so unique about Oregon is there are so many programs happening in so many different parts of the state, and so many ways to learn. And there'll be that information sharing at the annual conference. There'll be that opportunity to share best practices and to maybe take something that you've learned here and implement it in your community that crosses all these boundaries to address the mental health crisis.
When you have someone who's experiencing a crisis, they reach out to the people or the places that they're used to, and so usually you're going to have law enforcement who's responding to those situations. So if you don't have the funding that's able to help address those crisis situations, those individuals who are experiencing that crisis in a way that's meaningful to them, that helps them find a solution, then they're going to be rotated right through the system again, and then back on that phone with the potential police officers and law enforcement, and that isn't really the help that they need. So having those resources available locally to help that person in crisis find the things that they need, whatever it is that they're suffering from, making them feel like they have an option, they have some ways they can solve those problems.
Mental health is a challenge in our community because there just simply aren't the resources. even if you have good insurance, you can wait two months to get an appointment with a therapist if you're feeling suicidal. That's ridiculous. And it's the same, and it's even worse, of course, if you don't have good insurance. They just simply are not, we don't pay our mental health care professionals at levels that encourage them to stay in the business. We have people with master's degrees making less than $15 an hour. Of course, that's just not feasible. And so it's not only underfunded, it's underfunded at every single level.
In the state of Oregon right now, it seems like the primary mental health care providers are the prison system and the street. And that is not in any way a sustainable situation. We've got many people in the state who need mental health care, some very profound issues with mental health. And right now it's almost impossible to get it for them because there's just not the money. And we need state and federal support both to try to reverse that and do something about it, because this is a problem that everybody's seeing. When you look out, you see all the homeless folks. A huge percentage of those people are in fact suffering mental illnesses, and that's a big part of why they're out there. And it's neither economically realistic to just leave them out there, nor is it in any way ethically good or right to just ignore them and let them try to scrape out an existence on the streets. It's not good for anybody.
More clinics. I'd like to see intervention earlier. All these horrible stories we hear around the nation, the mass shootings and things like that. I'm convinced all of that's driven by mental health issues. And the earlier you can intervene and start finding some of those issues and deal with them and get people help, the better off society as a whole is going to be.
Certainly my personal opinion is that the state of Oregon has somewhat dropped the ball with regards to mental health oversight. I know beds that the state used to manage have diminished over the years. I don't know if that's budgetary issues or public outcry, but it's certainly impacting not only our local residents, it's also impacting our public safety from a county perspective.
Infrastructure is one of the most critical needs in Oregon. In the water department, as a matter of fact, we have a $7 billion deficit in water infrastructure that needs to be addressed across the state. That's a big ticket number, and that's just water. When we talk about all the other needs that we need, the roads, transportation obviously being a big ticket item, housing another big ticket item. So we have so many infrastructure needs in the state that need to be addressed, and it's going to take the work of federal, local, and state legislators to get this done, to get the appropriate funding, because it's all driven by the funds that are available. So if we are not addressing the infrastructure needs of the state, the needs are only going to get worse. Obviously, it's only going to cost more to address these things, and they are widespread, and they touch every aspect of the state as well.
How do we pay for keeping our roads up to see, because there's no such thing as a cheap bridge, there's no such thing as a cheap road, and it's a challenge for all of us. And so we try to utilize our resources, but again, the expenses are larger than our ability to do that. And it's not just my city, it's all the cities that we have to deal with, trying to come up with ways to pay for things, and nothing's gotten cheaper, and it is a real challenge with infrastructure. You also have sewer, you have water, you have stormwater, and people don't realize what it takes to maintain and operate those kind of things, to meet the clean water rules and to provide the kinds of things that people want. Everybody wants to pass off the expenses. Well, let's pay for it next year. Let's pay for it next year. There is no next year, because you got to get it done.
Aging infrastructure is a critical concern for our community. We have a need for a new water treatment plant, a wastewater digester, as well as street infrastructure needs.
We're looking at infrastructure issues. How do we address aging infrastructure, including water specifically, but also roads as well. And also probably the big issue I think most of our cities are dealing with is projected revenues and how we continue to provide the services that our communities expect with reduced annual budgets every year.
Streets is that's probably in their top 4 issues with regards to the community of Pendleton. We're trying to help inject input from our constituents to help find a funding solution. We've identified that we need about $2.2 million a year
The federal government has told us that we need to build a filtration plant for our water supply, which is going to cost $800 million or more for a problem which is questionable whether it even exists. And so I'm hoping that they will help provide some funding for that, but there's no guarantee of that.
We've got a lot of old infrastructure in the ground and in the sky, telephone wires and things like that, water pipes. And we find that, occasionally in Cottage Grove, we still dig up a wooden pipe, which is astoundingly obsolete. And the federal government used to provide a lot of money to help create this infrastructural system we have across the country. But since that spigot was turned off some decades ago, more and more deferred maintenance, as they call it, has happened, where you're not spending as much money replacing things as you would like to because you don't have the money to do it. And so you're having to use pipes that are in the ground a lot longer than their expected lifespans, and you end up with more broken pipes, more emergency repairs, more patches where you really need to replace a thing but you can't quite afford to do so. And what that leads to is a less reliable system and poorer service for our citizens.
There are a number of issues in Washington that I think are particularly important to Oregon. Transportation and infrastructure being a key one. Congress has been trying to put together an infrastructure bill really for a year and a half, 2 years. And cities across the country, including Oregon, have significant aging infrastructure that needs assistance from the federal government to repair and correct failing infrastructure.
We need to have a renewal at the federal level of the FAST Act and get us more money into the state, get us more money via the state for our infrastructure needs. But I know there's just not enough money to go around. There's a lot of problems with our bridges, our road repair money.
We have a railroad that comes through our town. It didn't have the funding to be maintained sufficiently. Its railroad bridge went down, and as a consequence of that, we saw a lumber mill close and about 110 jobs, good jobs, leave our area. So the lack of investment in rail infrastructure in our state has had a noticeable and significantly negative impact on Coos Bay.
Our community is over 100 years old now. Some of that infrastructure is the same age. And so, we've got wood pipes in the ground, we've got failing old iron pipes in the ground, and so that infrastructure is starting to dissolve essentially. We actually have holes in the ground where there's no pipe anymore. And so trying to dig up all those, find them all first of all, and then replace them, but also fund them when it's, on the backs of your city members. And so trying to put that in an affordable format so that we can still provide them safe, reliable water at an affordable price has been a unique challenge that a lot of our cities are facing right now.
PERS, or pension reform, is one of the biggest issues facing both employers and the state as well. This is simply a crisis that's growing as we have a graying population. As folks are leaving the workforce, we are finding ourselves burdened almost with having to pay for these retirement plans, and we simply don't have the fundings. And many cities find themselves in this situation where they're just facing this crisis, and it's a mounting crisis as people leave the workforce. So that's the biggest trigger here is PERS reform. It's something that really needs to happen. How do we address this? How do we take the burden off cities to make sure that we're still taking care of those who've served us so well for so long, but still being able to manage our city budgets?
There's only so much money that every city has, and so they have to fund the things that are most pressing and at the forefront of their minds when they're looking at their budget. So when we're talking about pensions and retirements, we have to look at other things we may not be able to provide as a city as a whole in general, I think as a society rather. Where are we going to cut things back? What programs are we not going to be able to offer? What are the things we'd like to see that maybe are a little proactive on an issue that we can't implement because we're looking at those additional costs that we've already kind of incurred?
Our pension costs are a massive percentage of our personnel costs. So we're not only paying the people who are currently paving streets or policing or whatever they're doing, we're also paying a lot of people who used to do those jobs and aren't anymore. And while I've got nothing against those folks, retirees deserve a pension, the way the pension was put together in the first place is really hamstringing our abilities to continue to provide services at the level people expect.
I think that a lot of the financial impacts that we are constantly struggling with are probably centered around PERS.
As a city councilor, the impact we see is that is additional revenue that comes into the city and that would otherwise be diverted towards infrastructure, towards services, towards public safety. These funds now go into the PERS, the PERS fund to cover those expenses.
Around Oregon, about a third of the personnel budgets are taken up with PERS costs, which is extremely high. I don't know, we just live with it. It's something we can't control, so we just pay it.
Because of the measure, 5 and 50, there's some compression issues that we run into, and most of us are at that. And so trying to figure out ways that we can maximize that revenue and still provide the same services, we're all at that crossroads of trying to figure that out. And so we're looking for some support and help at the legislative level, and hopefully that comes here in the near future, because we're going to have to start cutting services, including parks and police services and libraries and all the things I think community constituents have come to expect from their city, and that's a large concern for a lot of our member cities.
Property taxes don't even pay for the police department, and so those are the kind of things that we're all facing. And with the FCC wanting to limit our franchise fee ability, we have to pay for things one way or another, and that's what's going to happen. And all the cities are looking at the same challenges. Again, it's just where the decimal point is.
We have folks who are living on fixed incomes, and so they do need some predictability and they do need some relief, because right now they're in their homes, and it is what they have to provide that stable housing into their golden years. And at the same time, you have young families, people who are working full time, who are living paycheck to paycheck, and rising property, rent, property taxes, anything, it's all wrapped up together. That puts the squeeze on them as well.
Most of the population, over 80% of the population of Oregon, lives in a city. Hence, it makes sense to really be a partner with the state, to get funding, to get priorities taken care of, rather than being considered a special interest group. We want to be thought of as a partner to get things done. To that end, we've had great meetings with the governor. We continue to do so on a quarterly basis. We are in the process of an education campaign there with that administration. We're also in a process of collaboration and supporting each other's priorities. And I think this is the way to get things done. We can't fight this fight alone. We have to be in it together. So being a partner is key to this.
I think having the ability to make our own rules, right? Home rule, and that we have the power locally to make decisions that impact our citizens locally.
Why is that so important?
Because nobody knows your city like you and your citizens know your city. Nobody knows your urban climate, much like yourself.
They made decisions in this past session without having adequate information. They made decisions for cities without responding to feedback that they got from the League of Oregon Cities and from individual cities about how how we want our communities to develop. And they acted like we don't care about affordable housing, where of course we do. And we have been addressing that in the city of Portland through increasing density and different zoning, different kinds of housing. And yet they decided top down that they were going to tell us how to do it, and gave us a ridiculous time frame to do it in. It's really unfortunate when local decision makers don't get to make decisions for our communities in ways that work for our communities.
The state, unfortunately, tends to be pretty fond of trying to preempt local governments. Now, we live in a home rule state, which, at least in theory, gives local governments the power to do what they want to do with minimal interference from the state. The state legislature, however, tends to like to come up with what we would call one-size-fits-all solutions. And one size definitely doesn't fit all. Every city in the state of Oregon is different. There are some similarities among them. There are some very huge differences. And the people that know best what Cottage Grove needs are people in Cottage Grove. The people that know best what Baker City needs are people in Baker City. The people that know best what Burns needs or people in Burns. It shouldn't be a question about whether local governments can actually run their own cities properly, because the people running the local government are chosen from that city. And so to imagine that a bunch of people, sitting in the State House in Salem automatically know what's best for the people of LeGrand is just silly. And unfortunately, not everybody apparently agrees that that's silly, because we keep seeing one-size-fits-all solutions that just don't fit coming down the pike.
Where I see a lot of the erosion of local control is state regulations that we just have to meet, or planning that we have to meet. We're doing an update of our development code now, and fortunately we're doing it right at the same moment where now we have to deal with middle housing and all this additional housing types. So it just was fortuitous for us that now we can fold it in, but those kind of regulations that come down and suddenly we have to make them work in our cities are just so burdensome for us to do at the local level that sometimes it doesn't seem they're well thought out.
We need to be able to manage our own right-of-ways, manage our own destinies. We don't need the folks in Salem or the federal government telling us how to manage our communities, whether it's the FCC, land use, any of those kinds of things, because we know what we're doing, and it's really important. We don't need them telling us how our zoning should work, because we've got great citizens that are all volunteers that are overseeing all of those kinds of things. So we need people to let us do what we do in our community.
The organization, the League of Oregon Cities, was founded in 1925 on that very principle, to protect home rule. And that was our primary driver. That's why we started lobbying. That's why we have an advocacy team out there doing this on a daily basis, is to protect home rule, because we believe the best decisions are made by those who live locally and know the communities that they serve. And that's where power should reside. The state should be there to support those efforts, but the best decisions are made by those people who know their communities the best.
Well, affordable housing is housing that isn't necessarily the standard McMansion you might consider. A lot of developers tend to like to build larger houses because they can get more for them. But where we're suffering and what we're missing is houses that are more prepared for young families just getting started, for people who are maybe on fixed incomes, like the elderly. We have a huge shortage of those, and we really need a lot more of them. And that's what we don't have right now.
How is that impacting your community?
Well, what we're seeing is a lot of people having to move out of town because they simply can't afford rising rents and that sort of thing. We're seeing a lot of people moving into those homes who are coming from other places where maybe there's a little bit more in the way of liquid cash floating around.
Affordable housing is just one of those issues that has so many layers of complication. And we just talked a little bit about workforce housing versus affordable housing. Are they the same? Are they different? Are we trying to address those that are homeless, etc.? We specifically in Springfield worked with the legislature and our legislators and got a mobile home park bill passed that now it's going to allow St. Vincent de Paul to build a brand new mobile home park.
When we look at our median house price right now is over $330,000. That makes it really tough for people to be able to afford a house. So we're one of the two cities that got the exception to the urban growth boundary rules to actually build an affordable housing community in Redmond. So that's underway. We're working on doing the land use part right now to be able to annex that into the city. And we're going to build about 450 homes in there, half of which will be affordable.
In our area, we've seen a large increase in the homelessness population over the past few years. Rough numbers off the top of my head, I believe last year's count was around 1,200 individuals were homeless in a county of 65,000 people. The year prior, it was more towards 800. It's created an issue where we have folks out on the streets visible, and we see our neighbors out on the streets. I see between 6 and 12 people I went to high school with out on the streets every week.
What would you like to see happen?
I want to see some solution that we create that is not only a housing solution, but a comprehensive solution that helps people get back on their feet, back into the regular scheme of life. So that'll include housing, but that'll also include the peripheral supports for mental health issues, if those are present, substance abuse issues, for recovery, and for employment solutions, which I think is an aspect that's lost a lot of the time in the discussion. People get on with housing, they get on with recovery, they forget about employment and long-term purpose as a sustainable aspect of recovery.
Homelessness, you can't wrap it up in a bow and say this is what we need X, Y, and Z, but I think the ability to have the conversations about what's necessary for each community is key, and then the power to implement whatever that is. So if that's talking about additional resources, the state's making available to the local entities to solve those problems, to work in concert with other communities around them.
Everybody across the country, I think, it's people can't afford housing, and the federal government is not doing their part. They cut funding under Ronald Reagan and have not made up for it since. And so we're seeing the results of failed federal policy everywhere, including in Portland and the other cities in Oregon.
Telecom is such a huge issue here in Oregon for so many reasons. Obviously, if you don't have the infrastructure, then you're not as attractive for economic growth, and cities won't look at you if you don't have broadband, if you don't have 5G and these sorts of things. So it's a critical issue right now, and what we're trying to do as an organization is be that convener to bring together the private sector, the public sector, and again, the government together to come up with a uniform set of standards that we could at least implement for design purposes, to get cell towers in place and to get the better networks in place that will really be the driver to lift up Oregon and to get that economic driver going. So this touches all of us. There are some parts of Oregon that don't even have access to broadband, if you can believe that. Some cities, some schools that don't have access to broadband. We're working on addressing that, but it's that partnership that we have to have, again, with the private sector. They're not our enemy. They need to be our partners in this.
The challenge that I see coming forward is 5G deployment and working with communities, because that's our franchise right-of-way, and trying to work with cities to help capture that right-of-way access and be compensated for that. And so we have some serious concerns moving forward of how we're going to be compensated based on these corporations coming in and providing 5G service. Now, would that be valuable to our communities? Absolutely. But it has to be a two-way street, and that conversation currently isn't taking place at the local level.
Coming from rural Oregon, it's a high priority from our standpoint, where you have a lot of industry that does their workload remotely. The faster, the more access. Certainly from an education standpoint, in Eastern Oregon, specifically BDMCC, Eastern Oregon University, rely on high-speed interaction. It also allows more intimate connectivity with that education process. And the quicker, the faster, the technology-wise. Eastern Oregon, Umatilla County specifically, is home for a lot of data centers. And so that whole connectivity is from an entertainment standpoint, from a business standpoint. There's just so many facets that makes that so important. So it's a high priority for Eastern Oregon.
We talk about telecom, and 5G is currently the code word that everybody is talking about. 5G would require that local cities, the legislation from the FCC would require local cities to make utility poles available at a rate that we don't think is quite right for the various companies to put their 5G antennas on. So that kind of local control, that's the public's property, and we have a responsibility to take care of the public's property, and the FCC in this regard is not allowing us to do that.
So the League of Oregon Cities has a new website. I think that's the best and easiest way to find things, and that's www.orcities.org. We just launched our new website. It's very user-friendly, but that is a wealth of information. We welcome you to attend our events, our trainings. All these things are great. We're really a high-touch, high-energy organization, so we're out there at all times, touching all aspects of communities and community service. So if we haven't reached out to you, we welcome you to reach to us.